hear the Prophet ﷺ's name, we all say, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us in the Quran, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ittaqullaha haqqa tuqatih wa la tamutunna illa wa antum muslimun. O you who believe, have taqwa of Allah as Allah deserves, and die not except in the state of Islam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the greatest gift of all, that we live and die on this deen. Everyone say Ameen. May we be received by Allah on the day of judgment, and He count us amongst the believers. May He extend His shade when there is no shade except the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May we drink from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam's hand a single sip, after which there is no thirst. And may He recognize us with the familiar eyes of Rasulullah and see us as His brothers and sisters from His ummah. And when we meet Allah, may He enter us into the garden as we hear the verses we recite in Surah Yasin, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Salamun qawlan min Rabbir Rahim. Salamun qawlan min Rabbir Rahim. Salamun qawlan min Rabbir Rahim. We extend Assalamu alaikum to each other. What will it feel like to hear salam from Assalamu alaikum? So may this day of Jumu'ah, Jama'ah is the gathering. Jumu'ah is a day of gathering. May there be a reunion for this gathering in the gardens of Firdaus. And may all of us have a reunion in Jannah with our parents and their parents, all the way to Adam alayhi salam. And for our children and their children, all the way to the Day of Judgment. May those in our family who are not Muslim come to Islam. And may our neighbors and co-workers all find the light of Islam. And may all of us live up to our Islam and then be reunited in the company of the prophets and the righteous. In today's khutbah, we'll be taking a bit of a turn, and I'll be sharing the story of one of the great heroes of our deen. And this is meant to inspire men and women, even though this is a story of a female companion. Inshallah, this will be, and if you've heard the story before, it's inshallah a good reminder. But this is one of the most remarkable companions in the seerah, and today I wanted to share her story. I'm also really happy, it's my first time in a while I've had my entire family here, so I'm really glad. My wife, mashallah, all these times I've been coming giving khutbah, she's been holding it down at home. So we were all able to make it. So I actually drove back for my first khutbah to pick them up. So I have both my bodyguards here, and I have my wife Najia in the back. So I'm really happy to have them. They're going to try their best to distract me. There's like a game between us. I'm going to try my best not to be distracted by them. Right? They're welcome. I know, you're their uncle. You've been hearing about this guy since before he was born, mashallah. So he's literally grown up in front of you. Nur Muhammad and Ala Nur. He knows I'm talking about him. He's found protected position. For today's story, we find ourselves in the latter part of the Makkan period of the seerah. And to set a context for what's going on, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has already sent the most vulnerable amongst the companions to Abyssinia for sanctuary. So there's a Christian king, as many of us know, Najashi, and the Prophet ﷺ has sent his companions that were at the highest risk of persecution, led by Ja'far radiallahu anhu, who is the brother of Ali, right? They've been sent to Abyssinia. Now what's happening is that Rasulullah ﷺ is losing his political protection. And we know with the passing of Abu Talib, the Prophet ﷺ lost his political support. And with the passing of Khadija radiallahu anha, he lost his personal emotional support. So the Prophet ﷺ is at a point of vulnerability in a worldly sense. I'm saying in a worldly sense because in the otherworldly sense, he is never vulnerable to people. As he said when he was stoned in Ta'if, in that moment he is having with Allah, he makes a dua that they said literally shook the heavens, this dua that he made, right? In one of the parts of the dua, he said, when the Rasulullah said, Ya Allah, if you're not unhappy with me, like if this is not punishment, that you're unhappy with me. The stoning, he's literally almost stoned to death, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He says that if you're not unhappy with me, I don't care what these people do to me. So he's never vulnerable to the enemies. But in a worldly sense, he's vulnerable. Another example of that is when Hind, the wife of Abu Sufyan, who later became Muslim, but she was one of the fiercest enemies of Islam. She's the one that paid half the bounty for the killing of Hamza, radiallahu anhu. And she did some terrible things to Hamza's body after his passing, his martyrdom, right? But when Hind is furiously walking around the streets of Makkah with a sharp bone in her hand, she just lost her mind. She wants to attack the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ is literally sitting in a walkway of Makkah with Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and she comes by Abu Bakr, and in a furious tone she yells, "Where is he? Where is Muhammad?" Right? And Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu seeing the Prophet ﷺ right next to him, and then he looks back at her, and her face is red, she's full of rage, and then she storms off to try to find the Prophet ﷺ. And Abu Bakr doesn't say a word. And then he turns to the Prophet and he asks him, "What was that?" And Rasulullah ﷺ said that the angel, the archangel, the king of the angels, Angel Jibreel, he had covered me with a wing. And in his other hand, he had a weapon that he was ready to strike. And he said that had she taken one more step to harm me, he was going to strike her down. So the Prophet ﷺ always had this protection from Allah. But in a worldly sense, Allah is testing him, so he's allowing him to be vulnerable to the Quraysh. And in this moment, the Prophet ﷺ is looking for alliances. He went to 13 cities on his way to Taif, and then Taif gave him the rudest welcome you could, literally almost killing him on the way out of the city. Which was a major, it was a major error on Taif's part, but that will become apparent later, because he was still Qurayshi. He was from Banu Hashim, which is a noble tribe. He was the grandson of Abu Abdul Muttalib. And it's something very interesting. In the Quran where we recite, when in Surah Fil, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Quraysh, because the Quran is not just coming down to the Muslims, right? Everyone is going to hear the Quran. Well, in Surah Fil, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Quraysh, "Alam tara kayfa fa'ala rabbuka bi ashabil fil." Give me 1 second. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding the people, the Arabs, do you not remember the miracle of the elephants? When the elephants came and you were protected. This was not a miracle for the Muslims. Some say the Prophet ﷺ was actually born in the year of the elephant. This occurrence coincides with the birth year of the Prophet ﷺ. But this is, of course, pre-revelation. This is 40 years before revelation. But all of the Arabs knew about this occurrence. Are you guys with me? This is actually one of the interesting things. And they all know it was Abdul Muttalib, the grandfather of Rasulullah ﷺ, who stood up to Abraham. So even the people who are not Muslim recognize the Prophet ﷺ as the grandson of the great leader of Makkah, who God sent a miracle for. So even the people of Taif know who he is. Yet they stone him in such a vicious way. And then soon after, and during this time of great turbulence, there's an opening coming. But it's not what you would have thought. Because Makkah and Taif were the two power centers of the Arabs. Because they both were renowned because their economic systems were connected to the great economic vehicle of their time, which were idols. Right? So Makkah was known to have two famous idols. Taif was known to have one famous idol. The Medinans were different. And there's something very important about this. In Surah Abasa, Allah reminds the Prophet ﷺ. If you guys know the story when the blind man came to the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ was busy speaking to one of the chieftains. He had a very light frown. Abasa is not even a full frown. It's literally a wrinkle in your forehead, which is the lightest way of showing irritation. He didn't even hurt the feelings of the blind man because the blind man's blind. He couldn't see him. He only found out the Prophet frowned when he read about the Quran, when he heard the Quran, right? But the man he was speaking to, one of the traits of the Arabs that were opposing the Prophet ﷺ is they believed They were self-sufficient. They believed that they had no need for Islam. And to this day, one of the greatest traits that becomes a barrier to accepting truth is feeling that you are in need of nothing. So any society, I'm not going to name societies by name, like America or Israel. I won't mention those two societies. But any society that finds itself in a position of power, that starts to believe that they are everything, and they are in need of nothing, and everyone else is below them, that quality of arrogance is more dangerous than ignorance. The Medinas were ignorant to truth. The Makkans and the people of Taif were arrogant in their ignorance. Do you guys see the difference? Are you guys with me? So an ignorant person can always be guided. An arrogant person is not open to guidance. What is the trait of Shaitan? Shaitan's main trait was actually not ignorance. Look. Shaitan's main trait was not ignorance. What was it? It was arrogance. In fact, he was described by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as being the most knowledgeable amongst the jinn. He was the opposite of ignorant. He was knowledgeable. But he was knowledgeable and arrogant. Right? So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from arrogance. The Medinas were generally speaking more humble. They had not been built up by the Arabs as the great tribe. They had not been built up by the Arabs as this group that everyone was looking up to. So when the Medinas heard the deen, they came to Islam much more swiftly. And in this momentous moment of the Seerah, at the second treaty of Aqaba, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam is met with 73 sincere souls from Medina. And in the darkness of Makkah, in the outskirts of the city, the Prophet ﷺ meets with his uncle Abbas, radiallahu anhu. He meets with his uncle Abbas, radiallahu anhu, and they are now going to speak to these 73 companions. Amongst them, there are 2 women. One of these 2 women is the hero of our story, Nusayba radiallahu anhu. These 73 companions are going to be the core amongst the Ansar. So these 73 companions are going to be the core amongst the Ansar, and of which amongst them is Nusayba. Nusayba has brought her young son with her and her older son. The younger one is Habib bin Zayd. Everyone remember this name? Okay? Nusayba and Habib. Nusayba and Habib. Both of these characters are going to become very important. Nusayba radiallahu anha is amongst the 73 that take an oath of death with the Prophet ﷺ, that if Medina is to be attacked, they will defend the Prophet against all the enemies of Islam. And this is a big deal. Why is it a big deal? Because Medina is not Taif, it is not Makkah. You have the 2 superpowers of the Arabs. Medina is a small farming city. So for them to ally with the Prophet against his own people, who are the strongest amongst the Arabs, because of the whole elephant incident also 40 years ago, by this point it's 50 years ago, they were also seen as they didn't attribute it just to Allah. They attributed it to Allah and the idols. They were seen as the untouchable people, because God had sent a miracle to save them. So you never sided against the Arabs. But also they were the ones who had the Kaaba. If you wanted to make pilgrimage to the idols, you could never turn against the Arabs, the Quraysh. So when the Ansar took this oath with the Prophet ﷺ, they had everything to lose in a worldly sense. And they had everything to gain spiritually. And the question is, in our lives, when we find ourselves in a decision point, where we have to sacrifice something of this world for something of the hereafter, do we take the courageous route of the Ansar, or do we not? This is a question for all of us. When there is some financial gain that we can have that is displeasing to Allah, do we choose the other life, or do we choose the life of this world? And this is what distinguished the early companions, the Muhajirin and the Ansar, from the people who oppose the Prophet ﷺ. And may Allah make us more like the Ansar and Muhajirin, inshallah. So now, the 73 have taken their oath. But before it is complete, Rasulullah ﷺ, and it is very appropriate that we have a spirited 2-year-old here. My son, who is 4, he was the exact age of Habib bin Zayd. A 4-year-old boy, so just imagine the little guy that was running around here. A 4-year-old, they're almost here for the ambiance of the khutbah. The 4-year-old boy puts his hand out. This is very interesting. He put his hand out before the Prophet ﷺ put his hand out. Because the Prophet ﷺ was not going to take an oath with a 4-year-old to die for Islam. It's an oath. An oath is an oath. It was not like a cute moment. This was like a moment where the companions were crying. They were saying, "We are with you, Rasulullah." And then he saw a little hand come out. And he looked down and he saw it was a small boy. And we know from his timeline that he was between 4 and 5 years old. Because of what's going to happen later in the seerah. And the Prophet ﷺ looked in his eyes and then he took his hand. And Habib bin Zayd was one counted amongst the 73 who gave the oath to the Prophet ﷺ. And it was at that moment they heard a scream in the desert. The Prophet ﷺ walked into the darkness and he pointed out towards the scream. And he says, from this day forward, there's no more break for you. There's no more respite. And then he turned back to the 73 and to Abbas and to the Muslims that were there. And he says, do you know, and Abbas, most say he wasn't Muslim yet at this point, his uncle. But he said, do you know who that was? What that sound was? And they said, Allah and His Messenger know best. And he responded, that was Shaitan himself. And he screamed when he saw this gathering. Because he knows, this is the part we're adding, that his job had become very difficult now. And then the Ansar returned to Medina. And after taking the second oath of Aqaba, and the Prophet ﷺ returns to Makkah. Could I have someone's phone or watch? I just need to keep track of time. My phone. Is that okay? Could you just turn it? Now, Nusayba radiallahu anha, as I mentioned, there were only 2 women present in that gathering. For the women, the Prophet didn't grab their hand, he took their oath from afar. For the men, he actually took each hand by hand. Now, 2 years will pass. And now we're getting to the point where the hijrah is starting to commence. And Nusayba radiallahu anha is one of the leaders of the women of the Ansar. We'll fast forward 2 more years, and conflict has now started, because now the Muslims have established themselves in Medina, and we are now at the point of the Battle of Uhud. The Battle of Uhud is the second major conflict, and we know this, between the Muslim and the Quraysh, right? The first is Badr. In Badr, there is a lopsided victory for the Muslims, and the Arabs would call Badr the greatest military upset in Arabian history. The Qurayshi army has been defeated. It's not even, people say it was 1,000 verse 313. It wasn't just 1,000 verse 313. It was 1,000 of the best soldiers of the Arabs with cavalry, with all of their swords and shields and all their weaponry, against 313 that included children and people who were so old they couldn't carry swords. They were literally young people walking to the battle, dragging their swords. They didn't have enough weapons for everyone to have their own. They only had 2 horses in the entire army. This was not supposed to be a battle. This was supposed to be a massacre of the Muslims. And of course we know that the angelic support came. We know that the Muslims fought with great courage, to the extent that that day was called the day of Hamza. Hamza radiallahu anhu proved himself again that he was the greatest soldier on either side of the battle at the Battle of Uhud. And Hamza radiallahu anhu was 55 years old at this point. He was almost the exact age as the Prophet ﷺ. So even though he's the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, he was a young uncle. So they were raised like cousins. They were that close in age and in relationship. But then you have this incredible moment. And I want all my sisters to hear this next part. But I also want our brothers to hear. Because this is the potential that our women are supposed to have in our community. This is not like a feminist type thing. This is what true empowerment of both men and women actually looks like. Can everyone move forward so we have space for people coming? As we move forward in Jumu'ah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us place in the closest to Him, inshallah. When we make space for others, Allah makes space for us. And once again, if you heard this story, inshallah, it will be a beneficial reminder. The Muslims are having, once again, in a worldly sense, an improbable victory. Now we have 3,000 soldiers amongst the Quraysh. And now they have sent everyone. The Quraysh know that their reputation will not survive another loss. Do you remember I said that because of the attack of the elephants of Abraham, the Arabs had this idea that the Quraysh could never lose because God will send them victory. When they lost at Badr, it was sending some signal. This is very interesting. Just stay with me on this point. The Quraysh were untouchable when Abraham came with an army of 10,000 soldiers. Some say up to 100,000. Are you guys with me? Stay with me on this point if you can. They seemed untouchable. They had some blessing that was giving them protection. Now, a handful of people have left Makkah. And now the Quraysh go into battle and they lose. If you're really thinking clearly, you would maybe ask yourself a question. Could it be the blessing that was giving them protection has now migrated to Medina? You guys get what I'm saying? Could it be that it wasn't the idols that was giving the Quraysh their status, but it was actually the family of the Prophet ﷺ? So if someone is really looking at it, like, well, the Quraysh are untouchable, but now they're not. And now the miracle that was given to the Quraysh is now being given to this other group. The only common person that was there for both, because some say he was born that year. If he wasn't born that year, it was Abdul Muttalib, his grandfather, who was also not an idol worshiper, according to the majority of scholars. Could it be that that light has now gone to Medina? So the Quraysh knew they had to squash all these doubts. So now they sent Khalid bin Walid. Now they sent Amr bin As. Now they sent Abu Sufyan. They sent Ikramah bin Abi Jahl. They're sending their best of the best. Some of these people were not. Ikramah was there at Badr, right? But Khalid bin Walid was not, for example. They're sending their best soldiers. And now anyone that lost a family member at Badr is there for vengeance. So what is Uhud going to look like? 3,000 versus 700. It was actually 3,000 versus 1,000. But Abdullah ibn Ubay, the hypocrite, took 300 soldiers back to Medina at the last moment. He took 300 of the Muslims, but they were already 3 against 1. So now it was 700 against 3,000. So when the battle is going for the Muslims, the Qurayshis are like, they're seeing a repeat of the trauma of Badr. They are once again retreating. And everyone is in shock, except the Muslims, because they know Allah's victory is coming again. And this is when that critical mistake is made. 40 of the archers that had been placed at the rear of the army left their post. They left their own leader to die with the 9 remaining soldiers that stayed with him. And Khalid bin Walid flanked the army. It was at this moment that Nusayba radiallahu anha, who was a hero who is now reappearing in the story. She had come as a nurse to Omar. She had come with the other women to tend to the wounds. But what people didn't know until this day, that she was actually a great warrior herself. And she had been trained entire life in warfare. When she saw the tides of the battle turning, she literally dropped her medical supplies, she grabbed her sword, and she rushed into battle. And she saw her older son, not the one we mentioned, Habib bin Zayd. She saw Abdullah bin Zayd, who was, because Habib bin Zayd at this point was only about 8 years old. So he wasn't allowed to go to Uhud, of course. But she saw her older son, Abdullah bin Zayd, who was still young. She saw him being overwhelmed by the Quraysh. And he was bravely fighting back, 3 against 1. Every soldier of Badr and Uhud were fighting 3 or 4 against 1. Imagine, when you have 3,000 versus 700, that's just the way you have to fight. So you can imagine how trained they were in warfare. He's keeping 3 people away from him. And then Nusayba radiallahu anha runs to her son. Now I want all the mothers in this room.
little so people can go.
Everyone with me?
You go from there.
Even if there's some movement around you, let's stay together on this. And of course the fathers too, but specifically all the mothers in this room. I want you to imagine that you're seeing your son in battle right in front of you. And he is about to be struck down by the enemy. What will stop you? You know, my mother says, like, for my children, I can become a lion. Like, a mother has that instinct. Fathers too. But you see enough in fathers. I want you to put yourself into say. We can also put ourselves in her shoes. You see your young son about to be struck down. And you know you can make it in time. Is there anything that will stop you from getting there? Huh? There's only one thing that could stop Nusayba. Right when she got to her son, she was about to save him. She heard someone say, Rasulullah, Rasulullah! And she turned and she saw the Prophet's life was in danger. And she literally turned away from her son. Moments after that, Abdullah fell a shaheed. Abdullah died. He was killed. She literally left her son. And she ran, and the Prophet ﷺ had now been surrounded. Companion after companion had fallen, defending Rasulullah ﷺ. And there were only two companions that were able to push back the enemy. It was Ali radiallahu anhu, very epically. The Prophet was like on the bottom of a hill. Ali radiallahu anhu, this is a movie scene. Ali radiallahu anhu, literally his young cousin, who was now at this point 25 years old. He jumped from over the Prophet ﷺ. The scripture is very clear. They're coming from here. He jumps from over the Prophet ﷺ, lands in front of Rasulullah, and pushes the entire enemy back. And then it was Nusayba. Nusayba radiallahu anha, the Prophet ﷺ said, everywhere I turned, I saw Nusayba. And she took 70 wounds for the Prophet ﷺ at the Battle of Uhud. 70 wounds. And he told her after Uhud, that she survived. He said, Ya Nusayba, no man could have done what you did for me at Uhud. Right? I'll end with this. Habib bin Zayd, who I mentioned, at the age of 14, there was a great threat to the Muslims. And it was Musaylama al-Kadhab. It was the false prophet. This is the end of the seerah. He had come to Medina and become Muslim. He had gone back to Banu Hanif, and he was now claiming to be a prophet. And he had taken, listen to this number, nearly 10,000 people out of Islam. And they were joining him as a false prophet. He sent a letter to the Prophet ﷺ saying, I am a prophet just like you. We have to co-rule the Muslim Ummah. That's what he said. The Prophet ﷺ sent him a letter back, and he chose Habib bin Zayd, a 14-year-old, the son of Nusayba, the brother of Abdullah, who died at Uhud, Allah yarhamu, to take the letter. And long story short, even though you're never supposed to kill the messenger, the Muslims didn't hurt the messenger that came with the letter from Musaylama. They actually tied him up. And because there's young people here, I won't go into detail, but they ended his life in the most gruesome way possible, step by step, one thing. And he kept standing up on his own. And then some of the people who were with Musaylama actually repented in that moment when they saw that. And many of them came back to Islam. And that's how Habib bin Zayd kept his loyalty for the Treaty of Aqaba. Nusayba joined the battle against Musaylama, and Khalid bin Walid, who at Uhud was fighting against Nusayba. Now they were fighting together against Musaylama's army, and they said this was the greatest test the Muslims had in battle until they fought the Byzantines. And they were fighting against Musaylama's army, and Khalid bin Walid said there was a knight who was dressed in black, and he assumed it was a man. It was actually a mourning mother. That's why she was wearing black. And she had her face covered. And he said that I saw her charge into battle, and I said, oh courageous knight, stay back with us. And I couldn't control this knight. And the knight went into battle. And that was Nusayba radiallahu anha. She actually reached Musaylama, but he had already been killed. And another character of Uhud comes back. Remember the story of Hamza when he was killed? There was a man named Wahshi who threw the spear. He was now on the Muslim side. All the characters of Uhud had flipped. And Wahshi killed Musaylama, the same person who killed Hamza. He said, I killed one of the greatest people who ever lived and one of the worst. And Nusayba radiallahu anha was asked, do you feel bad that you didn't reach him before he was killed, that you couldn't take your revenge? And she said, no, because I know he is in the fire and my son is in paradise. This is the story of the great Nusayba. Ask Allah for forgiveness for his Umar.
Can we squeeze a little bit more? Other people can sit down. Yes,
Can everyone kindly come in? Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulullah, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Can everyone move forward?
We have more space for this. Yeah, that's space.
If everyone can kindly move forward, inshallah. Bismillah. So as we conclude the khutbah, lives of great men and women of our past remind us of our true potential. And they also remind us that we have a lot of leveling up to do. We live in a dunya that can limit our potential to so-called making a living and just having a relaxing life and then commenting online about atrocities happening. But we come from a people that were physically active in this world. And it wasn't just the men, it was the men and the women. We come from warriors and poets and scholars and people who build civilization. And this is what is actually demanded of the Ummah. So may we look at these examples not just as stories, but as light that we are meant to chase. Inshallah, please join me in dua. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها لها ما كسبت وعليها ما اكتسبت ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا وأخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين وأقم الصلاة.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.